we in a different location today because we're doing something a little bit more different. I will be ranking all of the books I read this year so far and telling you about which ones are my top favorite and which ones were a bit of a disappointment. Hello amazing humans on the net. The inspiration for today's video came from me watching other similar videos by other booktubers that I really enjoyed, where basically they reviewed a whole quarter of reading. And so this is what we're going to be doing today, except I will also throw in my December books into the mix. December 2024 that is, and that's because I've started my YouTube channel in November, so I feel like if I didn't include the December books, they would probably feel left out and they would never be included in anything. So instead of the 23 books that I have read from January to March, I will have a list of 29 books that includes the December books. And when I was wondering how to do this, I didn't want to just review every single book that I've read, because I feel like that's a bit of a cheating, that's a bit of recycling of something that you may have potentially already seen in my monthly wrap-ups. So then I thought, okay, so maybe I'll do the typical worst to best. But with this concept, I felt that it was a bit cruel to be listing some of the books at the very, very bottom, because even though maybe these books weren't necessarily my cup of tea, I'm sure they will appeal to some other audience. As you know, books are such a personal thing. And also, if you're anything like me, if you're watching similar videos, you just skip through to the end and you just listen to people talking about the best books they read. And so you kind of miss everything else. So in the end, I landed on ranking, and I have created 5 categories. And actually I have gone quite gentle on my categories, so I don't have any drastic descriptions like the worst books ever written, because again, I want to keep things fairly positive on this channel. And talking about this channel, I do want to say very quickly that we have hit 200 subscribers, which to me is just astonishing. It's a huge milestone. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for all those of you who have subscribed and who are watching my videos. It is a bit funny with BookTube, isn't it? Most of us, I think, don't do it for money, as in to earn income from monetization on YouTube. Just because if you were doing it for money, I feel like you'd go for different topics, for example, personal finance or technical skills around making YouTube videos, for example. These seem to be extremely universal and very popular. So most of us booktubers do it out of love for books. And even though we shouldn't care about the numbers of subscribers and all of the other analytics, weirdly, it is the only sort of metric we get to tell us that what we produce is of value, and you do end up watching the numbers a little bit. When you hit a milestone like this one, 200 subscribers, it is such a great feeling. Thank you again. It makes me feel so warm inside knowing that there is a like-minded community out there who enjoy similar books and who think that my videos are worth watching. I hope that they brighten your day a little bit. Anyway, let's jump into the ranking. Okay, so as you can see, I have created 5 categories. I did want to include a category on the books that weren't for me, but I didn't want to call it terrible books, because obviously they're not terrible books, they just were not a great reading experience for me personally. And for that category, I have created this red section here titled Pass, which means book that I would advise you to pass on, or books that I, well, simply found to be a bit of a disappointment. Then we've got okay but category. These are books that are fine, but there was an issue or a couple of issues that I had with those books. Solid is a category for books that are strong, books that I feel very confident about recommending them to other people. Great category Self-explanatory, obviously. This is a category for books that have been a great reading experience for me. And finally, new favorite. So these are the books I have not stopped thinking about since I've read them, and the books that I predict to stay my favorite for the foreseeable future. Let's dive in. First one on the list is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. I am very sorry we're starting on negative because I am going to have to put it into pass category. I did not enjoy this book. This is one of those rare occasions for me where the movie is better than the book. I just didn't like how very two-dimensional the main character was written. Next we have Carmilla, which is a vampire story, gothic vampire story that predates Dracula, which was a huge surprise to me because I didn't expect it to enjoy it so much. I am going to have to put it into the great category. It is very well done. It is one of those very eerie and sensual books, so perfect for autumn time, around Halloween or maybe winter time. Highly recommend it. If you haven't heard of it, do check it out. It's not very long, so you don't have to feel like you are committing yourself to a major undertaking. Next one is Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I forced myself to finish this book. It was longlisted for Women's Prize for Fiction last year, and unfortunately this book felt to me as if the author couldn't decide what is going to be the main focus of the book, and it ended up being a bit of a drag. So unfortunately I am going to put it into the disappointment category, and I really was hoping I would enjoy it after reading the first page in my local library. This is how I came across it, but in the end it didn't work out. The Handmaid's Tale is the next book. I'm going to put this into the solid category, not great. The reason for that is I am not a huge fan of dystopian novels, okay? I find it difficult sometimes to fully believe and get invested into this non-existent version of the world. Maybe it's my lack of imagination, I don't know. The book in itself is fine. It's very easy to read if you are trying to get into classics and you don't mind doing it with a modern classic, then this might be the one. But overall, it's not a book I think about often since I've read it. Next we have a collection of short stories, Black Vodka by Deborah Levy, who is slowly becoming my favorite author. I am currently reading her non-fiction, her trilogy. It's titled The Living Trilogy, and I can tell you it is amazing. I think the first book in a trilogy is actually in this list, so we'll talk about it in a minute. But this is her short story collection, and I would say this is also solid. Can't put it into the great category because I don't think I will ever put any short stories into the great category. I'm just not a short stories person. I much prefer to get my teeth into a proper, larger piece of work. Hetty Dorval by Ethel Wilson. I talked about this book in my separate video as part of the lesser known classics mini-series. Check it out if you want to hear about this book a bit more, because it is definitely worth reading and it's going into my great category. This is by a not very well known, here in Europe at least, Canadian author, but it's great coming of age story. Next we have contemporary fiction, a Nikki French duo and their latest release, which is another psychological thriller, The Last Days of Kira Mullan. I have to put this into okay but category. It's not a bad book, but I've read all the books by Nikki French and they have much better books in their repertoire. This is the first time with Nikki French, with this book, when I found Some of the characters a little bit too stereotypical, and the way they were written was overstretched. To Kill a Mockingbird. Do I need to say anything else? This is definitely going into my new favorite category. Do you know, this is one of those classics that absolutely deserves the hype that it gets. I think a huge part of it is the way it's written and the way it's told by a child. A perfect example of its greatness for me is when Atticus' son discovers that his father was the best shooter in the district. And the fact that he finds out about it not from his father but from other people quite randomly tells you so many things. Tells you that Atticus was a humble man who didn't like to boast about his, well, let's face it, pretty special skill set. And I think it takes a lot for a man not to do that. It also tells you that he was against violence, and this is why he didn't want to talk about his shooting skills, and he didn't want to use them unless absolutely necessary. And also it tells you what kind of father he was. He very deliberately was choosing what lessons he wanted to teach his children. Sorry about this, that was my daughter calling me on my mobile. Where was I? Yes, so this tells you basically also what sort of a father he was. Brilliant, brilliant writing, brilliant social commentary, and yes, my new favorite. The next book is My Name is Lucy Barton by Elizabeth Strout. This was one of the books I read in December last year, and it did find its way onto my top books of 2024. However, now that I've read more books, I am not sure if it's still my top favorite. I think I'm going to put this into the great category. Panenka by Ronan Hession, probably my favorite Irish author at the moment. Again, I'm putting it into the great category. It's a wonderful book, very strong writing in that sort of quiet but impactful style. And the only reason why it's not going into my favorite section is because out of the two books I read by the same author, it's the other one that I prefer, which is titled Leonard and Hungry Paul, which is not on this list because I've read this quite some time ago. Next is The Belgia by Sylvia Plath, which I'm going to put into the solid category. It's obviously very well known and very well respected classic, and I do have a lot of respect for the writing in it, but I listened to it as an audiobook, which was excellently done, and I think that was the reason why I finished this book. I'm not sure if I would have finished it if it wasn't an audible book, because it's just very, I don't want to say broody, but that's the word that comes to my mind. And sometimes with those sort of books I find myself a bit impatient. Right, Daisy Millenix by Henry James. If you've watched my video on my February monthly wrap-up, you know how I feel about this book. I am still very confused about this book, and I am still not sure what exactly the message the author was trying to convey to us in this book, because the only message that I can take from reading this book is the one I don't like too much, is that people who are open-minded and trying to do things a little bit beyond social constraints or being punished for it and meet quite a gloomy end. So for that reason, it's kind of in between those two categories. I can't say the writing was bad. I guess I'm going to put this into okay, bad, because really my main gripe with this book is the ending. Next we have Playing Games, a contemporary novel by Huma Qureshi. I really enjoyed this. This is about two sisters living in London. If you have a sister, you have to read this book. Very light but engaging and entertaining read. something that I highly recommend reading in between some more serious and heavier books. I'm going to put this into solid category. Pride and Prejudice is going into my new favorite. I didn't expect to enjoy it so much, and I'm looking forward to reading more Jane Austen later this year. Then we've got the Safekeep, shortlisted for Women's Prize for Fiction. I have read all of the books on the shortlist. Check out my video on that if you are interested. And I must say that this book out of the 6 shortlisted books was one of my favorite ones, and I highly recommend it. The writing is so strong in there. You've got perfectly maintained suspense throughout all of the book. You've got a character that you hate as you start reading the book, and then you grow to love her. You also have a historical and political context which adds another layer to this book, so I think this does deserve to be in the great category. Scaffolding by Lauren Elkin. I'm sorry. This has to go into my disappointment category because it reads like an essay and probably should have been an essay. A little bit like with Enter Ghost, actually, come to think of it. The book was undecided on what its focus point should be, and because of that, this was a failure for me. Standing Her Ground, collection of short classic stories by women authors. Very strong collection, but I am going to put this into... Actually, I'm going to put this into okay bad. And the reason for that is, even though these short stories, and some of them are excellent, are strong, I, for one, am not a huge fan of short stories, but also I've realized I much prefer to read short stories not as a collection by different authors, but as a collection per a particular author. And I guess that's just because this does allow me to get into the groove of that author's writing a bit more. Don't get me wrong, this is still worth reading. In this collection you've got Mary Shelley, you've got Elizabeth Gaskell, whose short story in there is my favorite, Kate Chopin, you've got Edith Wharton, you've got Virginia Woolf. So yes, definitely big names. But like I said, will I be thinking about these in a few months' time? No. Next is a play, Streetcar Named Desire. This will come to you as no surprise that I shall mark it as my new favorite. I talked about this in my February monthly reading wrap-up. I was so surprised how much I enjoyed this piece of work that was designed for the stage, not for reading. I devoured it, and actually this book made me crave more plays. So since then I have got myself a copy of Henrik Ibsen's plays, and I'm also planning to read some Chekhov, so stay tuned. But yes, this definitely goes into my new favorite category. And I have seen the movie, by the way. This was surprising to me that I roughly knew the plot, and yet I still enjoyed reading the play so much, which doesn't happen very often in my experience. Next we have Muriel Spark and her book titled The Driver's Seat. This was recommended to me by my very first subscriber, so this book will always have a special place in my heart. This, I don't know what you would call it. It is a modern classic. I guess it reads like a thriller a bit. There's definitely an extraordinary amount of suspense, but it's not like anything you've read before. And originally when I was talking about it in my January reading wrap-up, I was saying this is a very good book, but it's not for me because it is very peculiar and it has a very unhinged character. However, I have been thinking about this book recently more and more since I've read All Fours by Miranda July. I have no idea why. These are two very different books, but they both have female characters that are, in a way, unraveling a bit. And actually recently I have picked up another book from my local library by the same author, titled The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and I'm looking forward to reading that. So on that basis, I think for the moment I'm going to put this into okay bad category, but if I am going to do a similar video covering all of the books I read this year, for example, maybe I'll do that towards the end of the year, I wouldn't be surprised to see this book go up in my ranking by 1 or 2 places. Let's see, because I am truly surprised how much I've been thinking about this book recently. Then we've got The Moment of Lift by Melinda Gates. This is a non-fiction book which I've covered in my recommendations for International Women's Day. I think this does deserve to go into the great category. I think everyone should read it. It covers some real life stories that will make you cry. If I ever do a video titled Books That Made Me Cry, this definitely is going in there. Definitely a book that helps you gain perspective on the world and its problems and our lives and our place in it and our responsibility. Right, what's next? We've got Deborah Levy again, this time her non-fiction. This is the first book in her trilogy titled The Living Autobiography, Things I Don't Want to Know. I loved that book and it's going into my new favorite because it's amazing. I've just finished the second book in a trilogy, and once I finish the third one, I will do a separate video on this because Deborah Levy's writing is something that really speaks to me. Next, we have another short story collection, Things We Do Not Tell the People We Love, again by Huma Qureshi, who wrote Playing Games. Probably my favorite short story collection out of the 3 I read this year. I'll put it into the solid category. And then we've got E.M. Forster, Where Angels Fear to Tread. I read it in March and I did talk about it in my March monthly reading wrap-up. I think I need to read more E.M. Forster to decide whether he's the one for me or not the one for me. For now, I'm going to put him into okay but category, just because that book was a bit baffling for me. This is his first novel, so I am hoping if I pick up his later novels, for example, A Room with a View or A Passage to India, for example, they will be just that slightly more finely tuned. Next, we have another modern classic by Mario Benedetti, an author from Uruguay, and his very short novel titled We Among Us. Unfortunately, that book is going into my disappointment category just because on paper this should have worked. It's about a love triangle and it's told from 3 perspectives, but the way it was delivered just didn't work for me, unfortunately. The Wolf Border by Sarah Hall. Very, very strong book. I loved reading this, especially in January, because the book is set mainly in the winter time. Sarah Hall writes characters just like I like them. These middle-aged women who are a little bit broken. They are trying to reinvent themselves, and we sort of follow that whole process. This book is very atmospheric and I really enjoyed reading it. I am going to put this into the great category because I feel like not many people are talking about this book and it should be talked about. I did have small gripe with this book, nothing to do with the writing, but there were some spelling mistakes in there. So if you can find a different edition than this one, which you can see on the screen, which is by Faber and Faber, then please do. Because I must say it did affect my reading experience a little bit and I found it unnecessarily distracting. Next we have An American Marriage, a book that won Women's Prize for Fiction a few years back. Very, very strong writing in here. I am going to put this into the solid category. This is a portrait of a marriage that is losing its momentum. A huge focus on characters, not much plot, but very well done, and you read it in a way that doesn't feel like you read literary fiction, even though this is a literary fiction. It reads quite fast, considering that the book is actually quite slow, if that makes sense. Next we have A Rose for Winter. This is a travel memoir which I read when I was in southern Spain. I really enjoyed it. I did finish the book after returning to the UK, but I am going to put this in okay bad category just because I don't think this book would have worked as well for me if I wasn't traveling to the area that the book was about, if that makes sense. And then we've got 1984 by George Orwell. Obviously, very well respected classic, and I do respect it a lot, but I am only going to put this into the solid category again. I'm not a huge fan of dystopian novels, and I did have a couple of gripes with this novel. The writing doesn't feel to me as strong. I know that the point of the book and the themes that it covers is so much more important than the writing. And I'm not saying this is not an important book. I do think everyone should read it, but I felt like some of the sections were overstretched, and I definitely didn't like how the main female character was written. One of the subscribers told me there is a book called Julia that expands on that key female character, so I am quite intrigued to read that book at some point. But for now, 1984 goes into the solid category. And then we've got Effi Briest, which is a German classic. I'm putting this into great category, even though I don't think this book is for everyone, but it definitely spoke to me, and I still think about this book. This was written towards the end of the 19th century, around the same time when Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary were written, and because of that I think this book doesn't get the attention that it, in my opinion, deserves. That's it. That's my ranking of all the books I read in Q1 and in December 2024. I might do a similar thing for every quarter, because I think this might be helpful when we then get to the end of the year and when I have to collate a list of my top favorite books of 2025. Let me know if you enjoy this sort of format. Thank you, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.